Before we begin, forget what you think you know about healing, because this is not a story of escape. It is a story of return. Here, we do not run from darkness. We walk into it. Every word that follows is a mirror, and the question is simple. You dare to look at what looks back? There are moments when life fractures so completely that even breathing feels like trespassing into forbidden territory. It doesn't announce itself with thunder or flame, but with silence. A silence that stretches like the pause before a blade falls. The statistics are chilling. Millions wake each morning beneath invisible weight, yet only a few realize that what crushes the world, the shadow, depression, anxiety, despair, these are not mere illnesses. They are invitations. To refuse them is to remain asleep. To accept them is to descend. And in the words of Jung, there is no coming to consciousness without pain. The abyss is not a metaphor. It is a psychic event. It begins as a whisper, a slight distortion in how reality feels. The colors fade. Time loses its sequence. You wake at 3 a.m. with the sense that something ancient is watching from inside you. The mind begins to fracture into two witnesses, the one who suffers and the one who observes. That split is the first sign of the descent. The ego, terrified of dissolution, begins to claw for control. But the abyss has no mercy for the structures we build around our fear. It wants only truth. Jung understood this descent not as madness, but initiation. In 1913, when visions began to pour into his waking life, floods of blood, dead gods, oceans of serpents, he thought he was losing his mind. He wasn't. He was crossing the threshold into what he later called the objective psyche, the collective unconscious, the realm of archetypes that exists beneath the fragile surface of individuality. He kept notes in what would later become the Red Book, where he wrote, "I must learn that the dregs of my thought, my rejected doubts and fears, are the roots of what I am." Imagine him alone in his study, snow piling against the windows of Kusna, his breath clouding the air as he by candlelight. His hand trembles, but he does not stop. The shadows he confronts are his own, murderous impulse, divine visions, the raw forces of creation destruction. He calls them by name, speaks with them, negotiates. He realizes that the only path forward is downward. He must descend consciously to bring light into what the unconscious. That is the true meaning of facing the abyss, not to stare into darkness, but to recognize yourself in it. Modern neuroscience, decades later, would confirm the strange truth of Jung's vision. The brain's limbic system, the seat of emotion, memory, and instinct, communicates constantly with the prefrontal cortex, where logic and self-image reside. When trauma or despair overwhelms this dialogue, the rational mind loses coherence. Nightmares intrude into daylight. The unconscious takes command. MRI studies from the University of Zurich revealed that during depressive or dissociative states, the brain's default mode network, the circuitry responsible for the sense of I, becomes hyperactive, trapping individuals in recursive self-reflection. It is, quite literally, the biological echo of staring into the abyss. But ancient wisdom had already known this. The Buddhists called it dukkha, the inescapable suffering woven into existence. The Christian mystics called it the dark night of the soul. In the Hermetic text, it was the nigredo, the black stage of alchemical transformation, where matter decays to be reborn as spirit. Each tradition points to the same paradox, that the descent into darkness is not a punishment, but purification. What you call despair, the soul calls initiation. When the abyss opens, the first signs are subtle. The sound of your own name feels foreign. You move through the world as if watching from behind glass. Colors seem drained, voices sound distant. You forget what you once loved. The mirror reflects someone else's. People tell you to cheer up, but their words bounce off as though you are underwater. Then, deeper still, comes the second stage, the betrayal of meaning. Every action feels. You begin to suspect that nothing has ever been real. That suspicion is the doorway to the next phase, collapse. The ego disintegrates, unable to sustain its illusions. What follows is either madness or awakening. Societies, too, experience this descent. Jung saw it unfold in Europe during the rise of totalitarianism. He called it psychic possession, A collective shadow projected outward, consuming entire nations. When individuals repress their darkness, it seeks expression in the world. Wars, genocides, fanatic movements, these are not accidents of history, but symptoms of mass unconsciousness. The abyss expands until it engulfs the collective, and yet the cure remains the same, conscious. The act of looking inward, no matter how unbearable, becomes a rebellion against chaos. To survive your own abyss, you must become both explorer and witness. Jung would say, do not fight the darkness, illuminate it. Let consciousness be your only weapon. The moment you name your shadow, it begins to lose power. Record your dreams, speak your fears aloud. Confront the figures that haunt you instead of fleeing them. The unconscious is not your enemy, it is your origin. And when the night reaches its deepest point, when no prayer seems to answer and no light pierces through, remember this: the abyss is not there to destroy you. It is there to show you what cannot die. The self that emerges after the descent is no longer fragile, no longer terrified of loss. It knows that truth lives where reason ends. So, when you hear the call, when the silence grows heavy and the mirror darkens, do not run. Step closer. The abyss stares back because it is waiting for you to see yourself, and the one who dares to look is never the same again. It begins with a whisper, the soft voice that tells you, don't say that, don't feel that, don't be that. It is the first fracture of the self. Childhood is the laboratory where the psyche learns what it must hide to be loved. The moment you sense that parts of you are unacceptable, they sink into the depths. This is where the shadow begins, an exile not of the world but of your own soul. Jung once wrote, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. The shadow, then, is not merely darkness. It is the collection of everything you once were, before the world taught you shame. Imagine a child drawing with wild abandon. Then comes the hand of authority. Don't draw monsters, draw flowers. In that instant, the monster retreats underground, but it does not die, it waits. The forbidden emotion, anger, jealousy, lust, the desire for power, becomes a seed in the unconscious, buried but alive. Over the years, these seeds form roots that twist beneath the surface of personality, feeding on fear and denial. What emerges above ground is a carefully constructed self, a mask called persona. You wear it to survive. You wear it so that others will call you good. Jung saw this duality not as pathology, but as the essence of being human. He observed that every person contains an inner theater, where the actor, ego, performs under the lights, while the playwright, unconscious, watches from the darkness. The danger arises when the actor forgets the playwright exists. When that happens, the story begins to write. There was a patient Jung described simply as the woman of mirrors. She suffered from what appeared to be severe anxiety. She couldn't stand to see her reflection without trembling. Over months of analysis, it became clear that her fear was not of her image, but of what appeared behind it. In her dreams, a second woman followed her everywhere, silent, barefoot, her face half burned. Jung guided her into dialogue with this figure, a method he called active imagination. In one vision, the burned woman spoke, I am what you have done to your... The patient screamed in her sleep, but for the first time, she woke without panic. Recognition had begun. The darkness that terrifies us most is often the truth that has waited longest to be seen. Modern psychology confirms the phenomenon. Research from Stanford and the University of Cambridge shows that emotional suppression activates the amygdala, the brain's alarm system, causing the very anxiety people hope to avoid. The more we resist an emotion, the stronger it grows in the shadows of the mind. Cognitive dissonance, defense mechanisms, projection, all these are echoes of the same ancient dance, light turning its back on its own reflection. In spiritual traditions, this shadow is not evil, but incomplete. The Greeks spoke of the daimon, a guiding spirit that could turn destructive if ignored. The Gnostics warned of the double, a psychic twin who mirrors your virtues with their opposite. In Buddhism, Mara, the tempter of the Buddha, was not a demon to be slain, but a fragment of the self to be understood. Even in Christian mysticism, the devil often plays the role of the tester, the necessary adversary through which the soul refines its purity. Light without shadow is blinding. Shadow without light is despair. The balance between them is consciousness. The signs of shadow possession often arrive quietly. A sudden rage at a stranger, envy masked as moral superiority, a pleasure in gossip that tastes like venom. You convince yourself that you are right, that others are weak, corrupt, dangerous. But beneath that conviction lies fear, the fear that you are like them. Every judgment is a mirror. Every disgust is a disguised recognition. The more you condemn outwardly, the louder your inner darkness laughs, and then it deepens. Stage by stage, the shadow moves from passive to active. First comes projection. You see in others what you refuse to see in yourself. Then identification. You unconsciously mimic the behavior you hate. Finally, possession. The shadow speaks through you, and you do not recognize your own voice. You justify cruelty. You call control love. You rename envy as ambition. By then, the mask and the monster have changed. This process doesn't only happen in individuals. Entire civilizations construct collective shadow. Jung observed this during the rise of Nazism, an eruption of repressed chaos masquerading as order. He wrote that when a society denies its darkness, it begins to worship it. Flags replace gods. Ideologies replace souls. The masses chant in unison, believing they have found unity. But what they have really found is possession, the shadow of humanity walking in daylight. To protect yourself, Jung's advice was paradoxical. Do not resist the shadow, integrate it. Confront the impulses that disgust you, not to indulge them, but to understand their language. When anger rises, ask what injustice within you it points to. When envy appears, ask what unlived potential it reveals. When lust blinds you, ask what hunger for life it hides. Awareness transforms venom into medicine, and yet few dare to look. The ego prefers illusion, the comfort of denial. But denial is not safety. It is slow suicide. Every time you silence your own darkness, it finds another way to speak. Through the body, through dreams, through the world itself. The unconscious will not be ignored. It will manifest until you listen. This is the anatomy of darkness. A child denied, a soul divided, a life lived behind glass. To heal is not to become pure, but whole. The shadow is not a curse. It is the unfinished manuscript of your being. And only when you turn the page, when you dare to read what you once hid, does the story begin to make sense. Because the truth is simple and terrible. What you refuse to face will rule you. And the longer you deny the darkness, the more it will hunger to return home. The shadow does not arrive with thunder. It seeps in like fog under a locked door. You notice it first in the eyes of others, how they seem to reflect a version of you that feels slightly off, colder, more alien. That's how possession begins, not as madness, but as misalignment. Jung described this as the moment when the unconscious bursts through the thin skin of the ego, hijacking its voice, its gesture, its will. The shadow is a tight path, a narrow door whose painful constriction no one is spared who goes down to the deep well. It often begins in the mirror, a subtle disconnect. You stare too long at your own reflection, and something ancient stares back. The pupils widen. The air thickens. You can almost feel the weight of the other self behind your face. That gaze belongs to the part of you that remembers every cruelty, every humiliation, every pleasure denied. You built your life to keep it silent, but silence is never permanent. The more polished your persona becomes, the more violently the shadow demands recognition. And when repression reaches its limit, the mirror cracks. There was a patient Jung once described who suffered from obsessive moral perfection. He prayed constantly, served others tirelessly, and believed that suffering purified him. Yet every night, he dreamed of murder. He would wake drenched in sweat, haunted by visions of blood. The shadow, Jung explained, was taking the form of what he had most violently rejected, his own aggression, his desire for power. When the man finally allowed himself to imagine his violence, the dreams changed. The blood turned to ink. The murderer began to write instead of kill. The transformation had begun. In the language of modern neuroscience, possession is not superstition, but a neural takeover. The prefrontal cortex, the seat of rational control, shuts down under emotional overload. The limbic system, driven by instinct and memory, takes. MRI studies at Harvard have shown that during states of rage, jealousy, or fanaticism, the amygdala floods the brain with cortisol and adrenaline, creating a tunnel of perception where empathy collapses. In that moment, the I is eclipsed, the it. You are no longer the one who acts. You are the one being acted through. This is the monster in the mirror. It doesn't wear horns or claws. It wears your face, your voice, your smile. It tells you that you are just, righteous, superior, that you must punish, correct, dominate. But underneath that voice lies terror, the terror of powerlessness. The monster is not evil. It is terrified love that has forgotten its own name. Throughout history, cultures have recognized this possession by other names. In Greek tragedy, it was Hate, the ruinous delusion that blinds kings and heroes. In Christian theology, it was Satanas, the adversary that tempts through pride. In Buddhism, it was Mara, the deceiver who whispers, "You are separate." Each myth describes the same psychological truth, and the self is overwhelmed by its own denied It creates a false god. The signs of possession are easy to miss because they often look like virtue. The zealot who believes he serves truth but destroys anyone who disagrees. The lover who controls in the name of protection. The leader who sacrifices compassion for order. Jung called this identification with the shadow, the moment when moral blindness disguises itself as enlightenment. It's not the weak who fall prey to it, but those who believe they have conquered darkness. And yet, this phenomenon does not stay confined to individuals. Entire nations fall into collective possession. Propaganda becomes a form of hypnosis. The crowd chants, the rhythm replaces thought, and suddenly the masses move as one organism with a single primitive impulse: survival at any cost. History repeats itself because the shadow never dies. It migrates. It waits for the next civilization arrogant enough to believe it has transcended evil. The stages are predictable. First comes denial. We are not like them. Then projection. They are the enemy. Then justification. We must do what is necessary. Finally, possession. We are the only truth. In that moment, the abyss opens not beneath one man, but beneath millions. Jung saw it in his own time and warned that unless individuals learn to integrate their personal shadows, humanity will continue to reenact its collective night. To break the spell, the cure is awareness, radical, merciless awareness. You must become the observer of your own darkness without judgment. When you feel rage, do not act, watch. When jealousy ignites, do not justify, listen. When pride whispers, "You are right," ask, at what cost? Awareness interrupts possession. It reclaims the seat of the self from the hands of the unconscious. But this vigilance has a price. To watch your own darkness is to witness the of innocence. You realize you are not the hero of your story, but also its villain. You understand that the potential for cruelty lives not in monsters, but in ordinary human hearts. Jung said, "The psychological rule says that when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside, as fate. The wars you see, the betrayals you fear, they begin in the unlit rooms of your own mind. And so the monster in the mirror is not your enemy, it is your teacher. It shows you the line between awareness and oblivion, between freedom and compulsion. When you finally face it, the reflection stabilizes, the eyes soften, the air shifts. The monster smiles, and for the first time you realize it was never there to destroy you. It was waiting to be acknowledged. Because to see the monster clearly is to dissolve its power. The moment you understand that what terrifies you is made of your own material, the mirror becomes whole again. And what looks back at you is not darkness, but depth, the shadow integrated, the human complete. Night does not fall at once. It seeps in, patient and deliberate, turning the edges of thought into shadows. At first, it looks like exhaustion, then confusion, and finally, that silence is the first sign that the descent has begun. You start losing interest in the world. Familiar faces blur, words sound hollow. You feel yourself slipping beneath the surface of consciousness, as if gravity itself had reversed direction. Jung called this enantiodromia, the turning of things into their opposite. Light collapses into dark, joy becomes terror, certainty decays into doubt. This is the nightfall of the mind. It does not announce itself with drama, but with subtle disorientation. The psyche begins to withdraw its energy from the outer world and redirect it inward. The soul closes its doors. In Jung's Red Book, he describes wandering through vast inner landscapes, deserts of bone, seas of ink, forests made of mirrors. Each vision represented a descent into deeper strata of the unconscious, where meaning dissolves into symbol. There you no longer think, you are thought. You no longer dream, you are dreamed. To the rational mind, this is indistinguishable from madness. And yet, Jung insisted, it is a necessary stage of individuation, the process of becoming whole. The way is not upward, but toward the depths. The descent is not a failure. It is the soul's demand for authenticity. You cannot rise until you have gone under. You cannot awaken until you have died a little. Clinical psychology today calls this the liminal crisis, a transitional state between identity. Studies from the University of Toronto show that during such periods, the brain's default mode network, responsible for maintaining self-coherence, temporarily destabilizes. This neurological collapse mirrors the archetypal descent into the underworld, where the ego disintegrates before rebirth. The myths knew this long before science. In Greek myth, Orpheus descends into Hades to retrieve Eurydice. In Sumerian legend, Inanna enters the underworld and is stripped of her jewels, her power, her name. In Christianity, even Christ descends into hell before resurrection. Each tale encodes the same psychic. The underworld is not punishment, it is purification. The descent strips you bare, exposing what the daylight self. Every mask falls away until only the essential remains. But the journey is perilous. Jung warned that without guidance, the wanderer can drown in the chaos. The unconscious is not kind. It seduces with archetypes, images that feed on emotion. The anima whispers promises of divine union. The shadow tempts with power. The old gods of instinct awaken, offering ecstasy at the price of surrender. To survive, you must not identify with any of them. You must observe them like storms crossing the ocean of the mind. Awareness is your rope. Lose it, and you are swallowed. Jung himself nearly drowned there. During the years of his inner descent, he wrote of a vision where he stood at the edge of a black sea. Beneath the surface, faces stared upward, millions of human souls drifting. Then a red serpent rose, wrapped around his body, and whispered, "You are not who you think you." He fell into the water and saw his own reflection dissolving into the faces below. When he awoke, he realized the serpent was not evil. It was life itself, the raw instinct he had exiled through intellect. The descent had shown him the cost of denial. The soul becomes fragmented when instinct is. Modern therapy echoes the trauma research at Columbia University demonstrates that dissociation, our attempt to escape unbearable emotion, creates fragmented selves within the psyche. Each fragment carries a piece of the original wound. The descent, then, is the process of gathering feeling what was once unbearable and integrating it into consciousness. In that sense, hell is not. It is inside us, and salvation is not escape, but remembrance. The signs of psychological nightfall are often misunderstood: sleep without rest, laughter that sounds rehearsed, a sense that something follows you when no one is there. You might feel your emotions like autumn leaves drifting away from the people around you. Sense the change, not name it. They say you seem distant, colder. You want to tell them they are falling, but words are the underworld has no language. It speaks in symbols. You see crows in your dreams, flooded rooms, clocks without hands. The psyche is signaling through image what the ego refuses to admit. The old self is done. At this stage, most people resist. They seek distraction, new jobs, new lovers, new faiths, anything to avoid the silence. But the silence is sacred. To resist the descent is to delay the transformation. Every myth, every initiation rite warns of this truth. The gate to light is guarded by darkness. Jung wrote, "No tree can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell." To heal, you must go where your light cannot follow. If you endure long enough, something extraordinary happens. In the darkest point of descent, where identity dissolves completely, you encounter the self, not the ego, but the organizing principle of the psyche itself. It appears as a voice, a symbol, a presence. Jung experienced it as Philemon, a wise old man with kingfisher wings. To others, it may appear as an ancestor, a child, a star. The form is irrelevant. What matters is the recognition. You are not falling into madness. You are falling into meaning. When you return from the underworld, the world itself looks different. The colors are rawer, the air heavier, every sound carrying the echo of silence. You realize that everything you feared losing was never yours to. What remains is awareness, clear, ruthless, alive. The descent has burned away illusion. What's left is truth, but truth is not gentle. It does not comfort. It transforms, and once you have seen the underworld within, you can never again pretend that light exists without shadow. You understand that the nightfall of the mind is not a curse. It is initiation, the beginning of vision, because only in darkness can the inner eye begin to see. At a certain depth, silence ceases to be empty. It begins to speak, not in words, in images, murmurs, and sensation that feel both alien and familiar. This is the stage where the descent becomes the abyss, once mute, begins to. Jung called this sacred exchange active imagination, a method he used not to control the unconscious, but to collaborate with it. He believed that if you listen carefully enough, your dreams, fears, and visions will reveal a hidden intelligence, one that has always known who you are. It begins in solitude. The room is dim, the air still. You close your eyes and wait. Thoughts drift like debris on black water. Then, from the depths, a figure emerges. It could be a face, an animal, a fragment of memory. It approaches with the authority of something ancient. This is not hallucination. It is communication. Jung once wrote, "The images of the unconscious place a great responsibility upon a man. Failure to understand them deprives him of his wholeness. The mind you thought was yours alone is a crowded house, and the tenants have grown restless." He learned this the hard way. During his confrontation with the unconscious between 1913-17, Jung documented hundreds of dialogues with the inner figures he met. Some were terrifying, a serpent that whispered in riddles, a blind prophet who cursed him, a child crowned with thorns. Others were luminous. Philemon, the winged old man who became his inner teacher, guiding him through visions of death and rebirth. These encounters were not metaphors to Jung. They were experiences as real as waking life, each conversation leaving behind insight, fear, or revelation. Modern psychology now acknowledges the value of this dialogue. Studies on internal family systems therapy, pioneered by Richard Schwartz, confirm that the psyche operates as a multiplicity, a system of sub-personalities or parts, each with its own voice, emotion, and agenda. What Jung intuited as archetypes, neuroscience now maps as neural networks of identity and emotion. When you converse with these parts, rather than repress or moralize them, the brain's limbic system calms and integration becomes possible. Science, at last, is catching up to myth, but the dialogue is not without peril. The unconscious does not speak politely. It uses the language of dreams, symbols that can overwhelm the rational. Jung warned that one must enter this process with reverence and caution, for the psyche can devour those who seek power instead of understanding. He compared it to alchemy, the transformation of base metal into gold. The gold in this case is consciousness itself, but the furnace burns anyone who approaches without humility. One of his patients, a man haunted by recurrent dreams of drowning, resisted engaging with his visions. He called them nonsense, a waste of intellect. Jung persuaded him to draw the images instead of analyzing. Reluctantly, he began sketching waves, whirlpools, dark hands reaching up. As the drawings accumulated, the man began to weep without knowing why. In that surrender, he remembered a memory buried childhood of watching his brother drown in a river. The dreams were not punishment. They were an invitation, remember, to release. Healing began the moment the dialogue became honest. In many traditions, this act of inner conversation is sacred. The shamans of Siberia speak with spirits of ancestors. The yogis of India commune with archetypal deities in meditation. The Gnostics believed in the daemon, an inner guide that connects the soul to divine intelligence. Even the biblical prophets describe hearing a still, small voice. Each of these paths teaches the same truth. The divine and the psychological are not separate realms, but different languages describing the same encounter with the unknown. As you descend deeper into your own psyche, you begin to recognize the patterns of its speech. Anger appears as fire, sorrow as water, intuition as wind. The unconscious speaks in elements. It demands participation, not analysis. You must let it paint through you, write through you, move through you. When Jung wrote the Red Book, he said he did not compose it. It composed him. He merely followed the voice where the signs that the dialogue has begun are unmistakable. Your dreams grow vivid, cinematic, charged with emotion. Coincidences, synchronicities, start to multiply. A symbol you saw in meditation appears on a stranger's necklace. A phrase you wrote in your journal is spoken aloud by someone who couldn't have known. Reality itself begins to bend around meaning. Jung saw these events not as miracles, but as evidence of the psychoid, the point where mind and matter converge. The boundary between inner and outer dissolves, revealing that both are faces of the same intelligence. But this dialogue comes with rules. The unconscious must be treated as equal, not servant. You cannot command it, only invite it. Approach it with arrogance, and it will answer with chaos. Approach it with fear, and it will mirror your terror. Only presence, grounded, silent, aware, can sustain communication without collapse. Jung often instructed his patients to record their inner dialogues, draw their images, or even act them out in ritual form. The goal was not to control the figures, but to understand their purpose. Each represented a fragment of psyche demanding integration. Eventually, you realize that the voices are not intrusions. They are the echoes of your own wholeness calling you home. The monster, the child, the sage, all are facets of the same diamond. When you accept them, they stop shouting. They begin to sing. The psyche, once divided, starts to remember it. And yet, something profound happens in this harmony. You begin to feel the presence of something beyond the personal. A vast intelligence watching through your eyes, breathing through your lungs. Jung called this the self, the totality of consciousness and unconsciousness united. To meet it is to realize that you were never alone in the abyss. The abyss was never empty. It was always full of you, of all humanity, of the entire history of being. When you listen long enough, the voices in the depths change tone. They stop warning and start teaching. The abyss stops staring and begins to... You understand that the descent was never about conquering darkness, but learning its language, because what you call the unconscious is not beneath you. It is your foundation, and the moment you learn to speak with it, you no longer fear the night within. The abyss, finally, is an oracle. Pain. It is the faint hum beneath every thought, the pulse in your throat when silence grows too long. Most people try to escape it through distraction, medication, denial. But Jung understood something few dare to accept, that suffering is not an error in the human design. It is the crucible of transformation. To the unconscious, pain is the fire that burns away illusion. It is the heat of psychic alchemy, turning base instinct into gold awareness. The only way out of pain, he said, is through it. The process begins when resistance collapses. You stop pretending that everything is fine. You stop rehearsing smiles. You stop performing survival. And in that collapse, something ancient stirs. The philosopher's stone of the soul, the self, awakens when the ego finally admits defeat. That moment, which the world calls despair, is in truth the opening of the vessel. Alchemy begins when the old identity cracks. Jung studied medieval alchemists not because he believed in literal transmutation, but because he saw in their symbols a psychological map. The nigredo, the blackening, represented the stage of suffering, decay, and chaos. The albedo, the whitening, symbolized purification and clarity, and the rubedo, the reddening, was rebirth, the union of opposites, the birth of the whole self. Every human life, he realized, follows this sequence. First darkness, then dissolution, then light. But the fire cannot be skipped. He once treated a woman whose husband had died suddenly in an accident. She spoke calmly, mechanically, insisting she was strong. Yet in her dreams, Jung noticed recurring imagery: a house burning, a bird without wings, a child trapped behind glass. These were not symbols of resilience, they were cries for recognition. When she finally allowed herself to feel the rage, the guilt, the unbearable loneliness she had suppressed, her dreams shifted. The child stepped through the glass. The bird's wings healed. Suffering had done its work. It had dissolved the mask. Modern neuroscience echoes this ancient truth. Research from Johns Hopkins University shows that trauma, when processed consciously rather than repressed, triggers neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to reorganize itself. Emotional pain stimulates growth in regions associated with empathy, intuition, and meaning-making. The same circuits that light up in anguish also ignite during profound spiritual experiences. The line between agony and awakening is thinner than we imagine. Still, the path is brutal. Suffering will strip you of comfort, certainty, and pride. It will drag you into a landscape where logic disintegrates and only feeling remains. There you confront your naked self, the one that breathes without mask. Jung called this confrontation the crucifixion of the ego. It is the psychic equivalent of death. But just as the alchemist's lead must melt before it can become gold, the ego must surrender before the self can emerge. The ancient mystics knew this process well. In Christianity, it is the passion of Christ, agony transfigured into resurrection. In Buddhism, it is the dukkha that leads to enlightenment. In Sufism, it is fana, annihilation in the divine. All these paths share one truth: pain, when endured consciously, becomes initiation. It burns the false to reveal the real. The alchemist inside you knows this. That is why, even in despair, there is a strange pull toward meaning. The signs of transformation appear gradually. At first, the pain feels endless. Then, one day, you notice something subtle. The fear that once controlled you begins to lose its grip. The memories that once broke you start to feel like teachers. You stop asking, "Why me?" and begin to ask, "What is this trying to show me?" The fire still burns, but it no longer consumes. It illuminates. This is the albedo, the whitening. The moment clarity begins to return. But the true miracle happens when the heart, once shattered, begins to feel compassion, not in theory, but in the raw, trembling way that only suffering can teach. You start to recognize the same pain in others, their silence, their rage, their confusion. You see yourself in them. Empathy, Jung said, is not born of virtue, but of wounds. The scar becomes the bridge between souls. The alchemist, having burned in his own fire, now carries light for others. Yet the transformation is not complete until the rubedo, the reddening, the stage of union. Here, love and shadow fuse. You no longer divide your experience into good and evil, pleasure and pain, divine and human. You see that every contrast was a tool of awakening. Suffering was never your enemy. It was your teacher, your initiator. Jung called this the conjunctio, the sacred marriage of opposites. When the conscious and unconscious unite, the psyche becomes whole. The wound, instead of closing, becomes a portal through which meaning enters the world. From this point forward, life feels different. Even grief carries a strange beauty. You begin to sense the pulse of something eternal beneath every loss. You understand that pain was not proof of failure, but the proof of being alive. The alchemy of suffering is not about escaping darkness. It's about discovering the light that can only exist because darkness once surrounded it. And so the final truth reveals itself quietly. Transformation hurts because creation hurts. Every star is born from collapse. Every soul is reborn through surrender. Pain is not the opposite of peace. It is its doorway. When you finally understand this, you no longer ask the universe to spare you from suffering. You ask only to be conscious while it burns. Because the one who can stay awake in pain becomes something rare, someone who has turned their own anguish into light. There is a moment in history when reason goes silent, when nations begin to dream, not as individuals, but as one fevered organism. You can feel it in the air, an invisible tension, the pulse of something ancient, rising beneath politics, beneath morality, beneath logic itself. Jung called this psychic epidemic collective possession. It begins when a civilization's repressed shadow breaks free and demands to be worshipped. It doesn't come with horns, it comes with flags, slogans, with certainty. Humanity, Jung warned, is rarely aware of its own mind. When individuals deny their darkness, the collective will express it for them. What one person represses becomes the property of the crowd. History, in that sense, is psychology externalized. Wars are projections of the inner conflict. Genocide is hatred institutionalized. Ideology is the ego's last defense against the terror of its own unconscious. The collective shadow is not an idea, it is a force. It begins innocently enough. A people feel humiliated, unseen, or betrayed. Economic hardship or moral decay opens a psychic wound. Into that vacuum steps a new archetype, the savior. Jung recognized this pattern during the rise of Hitler. Germany, humiliated after World War I, sought redemption. The collective unconscious, starved of meaning, summoned the oldest image of order, the Redeemer King. But as Jung observed, when the Redeemer archetype is possessed by the ego, it transforms into its opposite, the destroyer. The Savior promises unity, but delivers annihilation. He wrote in 1936, "The larger the crowd, the more negligible the individual." When people merge into a group identity, personal responsibility dissolves. The ego is absorbed into a collective psyche that obeys emotion, not reason. The result is mass hypnosis, a shared dream in which atrocities seem righteous. Jung compared it to a return to the primitive state, where the tribal god demands sacrifice to ensure survival. Civilization becomes the altar, humanity, the offering. Neuroscience now confirms the biological mechanics of this possession. Studies from Princeton show that during synchronized group behavior, chants, marches, rallies, the brain's mirror neurons create emotional contagion. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for critical thought, goes quiet. In its place, the limbic system surges. The individual literally loses their sense of separate identity. This is why crowds can do what single men would never imagine. In the trance of the collective, the monster wears 1,000 faces and no one's name. Ancient traditions understood this danger. The Greeks called it mania, divine madness. The Hebrews called it the spirit of the false prophet. The Buddhists spoke of mass delusion, the shared illusion that blinds entire generations. Jung saw in these myths a timeless warning. Consciousness is fragile. The collective psyche is always one step away from regression into chaos. When nations abandon introspection, they fall under the rule of archetype. You can see it now in the modern world, more subtle but no less pervasive. The collective shadow no longer marches in uniform. It scrolls, it tweets, it hides behind digital avatars, spreading outrage and virtue like viruses. Social networks have become psychic amplifiers, vast mirrors reflecting and multiplying humanity's unintegrated fears. What you call polarization is not political, it is mythological. The gods have returned not as deities, but as algorithms, each one feeding the hunger for certainty, control, and moral purity. The symptoms are unmistakable. Outrage becomes identity, compassion becomes weakness, dissent becomes heresy, and slowly reality bends. Each tribe invents its own truth, its own demons, its own gospel. Jung would have called this the fragmentation of the collective soul. Without consciousness, the psyche splits into opposing camps, each projecting its darkness onto the other. The result is endless conflict, both sides fighting shadows of themselves. History has shown where this leads. When the collective shadow dominates, civilization becomes theater for archetypal drama. The hero and the villain, the martyr and the monster. The narratives repeat, only the costumes change. Rome burned with it. Europe bled with it. Jung warned that the next eruption would not be fought with armies, but with ideas. Warfare disguised as ideology. Where love rules, there is no will to power, he wrote. Where power predominates, love is lacking. The one is the shadow of the, and yet the cure is the same as for the individual. Awareness, the consciousness of even a few, can hold back the madness. Jung believed that each person who integrates their own shadow adds light to the collective. He compared this to a flame in the darkness, small, but enough to reveal the faces of those around it. Society changes not by decree, but by contagion of awareness. The more individuals awaken, the weaker the collective trance becomes. But awakening demands courage. It means resisting the seduction of certainty, standing apart from the chorus of indignation, and asking, what part of this madness lives in me? To look at the world and see not enemies, but mirrors. To realize that the rage you despise is your own unclaimed fire. Jung's remedy was not political but spiritual. Whoever looks into the mirror of the water will see first of all his own face. Whoever goes to himself risks meeting himself. The meeting is the beginning of wisdom. The first step toward healing the world is silence, not the silence of apathy, but of listening. To sit with your own contradictions until they stop being enemies. To speak truth not as weapon, but as mirror. When enough people do this, something collective shadow retreats, starved of projection. The gods of hysteria lose their worshiper, and in that quiet, the possibility of consciousness returns. Because what Jung understood, and what modern civilization still refuses, is that evil is not the opposite of good. It is the unlived good, the inverted life. Until we reclaim it, humanity will keep dreaming in nightmares. The collective will keep burning what it refuses to. Only when the individual becomes conscious does society begin to. And perhaps then, for the first time in history, the human race will look into its own abyss and, instead of falling, finally begin to see. When everything collapses, beliefs, purpose, identity, what remains is not silence, but echo. The echo of who you once were reverberating through a hollowed mind. This is the labyrinth, the psychic maze that follows destruction. Every wall looks familiar. Every turn leads back to where you started. Jung described this stage as the in-between, a psychic purgatory where the old self has died, but the new one is not yet born. You wander, haunted by fragments of meaning, clinging to memories that no longer fit. The danger is not in being lost, it is in mistaking the labyrinth for the world. Collapse is not the end of meaning, it is the dismantling of false meaning. The ideals you once worshipped, career, the relationship, the image of who you were supposed to be, disintegrate, leaving only raw existence. Jung believed that the modern soul suffers not from lack of pleasure, but from lack of purpose. People grow neurotic and they fail to find meaning in their lives. But meaning cannot be found by chasing light. It must be extracted from darkness. The labyrinth is the furnace where that extraction occurs. In the ruins of belief, the psyche begins to reorganize itself. You start asking questions that terrify the ego. What am I without my roles, without my past, without hope? At first, there is no answer. Then, gradually, something whispers from the depths, a faint awareness that you are not the structure that collapsed. You are the consciousness witnessing its decay. That realization, though small, is seismic. It marks the beginning of individuation, the process of becoming what you truly are, not what the world required you to be. Jung saw individuation as the central purpose of human life. It is not self-improvement, nor self-expression, but self-realization, the awakening, the total psyche. And yet individuation cannot occur without destruction. No birth of consciousness, he wrote, without pain. The labyrinth then is both tomb and womb. The darkness that buries you is the same darkness that gestates you. Consider the myth of the Minotaur. The beast in the labyrinth is not the enemy. It is the repressed instinct demanding to be faced. Theseus's victory was not in killing the monster, but in confronting what it represented, the chaos within him. Ariadne's thread, the golden line that led him back to the surface, symbolizes awareness. Consciousness is the thread through the labyrinth of despair. You don't escape by force. You navigate by seeing. In Jung's own descent, the labyrinth took form through vision. He dreamed of endless corridors, shifting walls, doors that opened to nothing. At first, he fought them. Then he realized that the labyrinth was not outside, it was his psyche, reconstructing it. The more he surrendered to the process, the more the maze revealed its pattern. Each turn, each dead end, was a necessary detour in the architecture of rebirth. Modern psychology mirrors this mythic. Research on post-traumatic growth from the University of North Carolina shows that after extreme psychological collapse, many individuals report deeper spirituality, increased empathy, and renewed life purpose. The very systems that once supported the old identity dissolve, forcing the brain to create new neural pathways. The labyrinth, from a neurological standpoint, is the process of rewiring the self after devastation. Suffering is the sculptor of consciousness, but the passage is perilous. The labyrinth seduces with illusions, false exits that promise relief but deliver repetition. Spiritual bypassing, escapism, addiction, ideological certainty, all are corridors that circle back to despair. Jung warned that the ego, desperate for stability, will cling to any idea that restores a sense of order. Yet true healing demands surrender, not control. You must stop seeking the exit and begin listening to the walls themselves. Every brick is a memory, every echo a fragment of the soul waiting to be acknowledged. You will know you are nearing the center when time begins to dissolve. The future no longer matters. The past loses authority. What remains is the raw immediacy of being, breath, heartbeat, awareness. In this timeless space, meaning stops being something you invent and becomes something perceive. The labyrinth was never meant to be. It was designed to be understood. And when understanding finally dawns, it does not arrive as triumph, as stillness. You realize it was built avoidance. Every turn, every wall, a boundary made. The moment the structure dissolved. There is no explosion, no revelation, only light. The labyrinth was never a prison. It was a mirror. From that mirror emerges a quieter self, one that no longer needs certainty to live, nor perfect to love. Meaning is no longer something sought in external validation, but experienced as an inner resonance. The simplest acts, a breath, a glance, a moment of silence, become sacred. Jung called this participation mystique, the state where the individual recognizes as part of the greater whole. But this integration does not end the struggle. The labyrinth still exists. Only now you walk it consciously. The walls remain a guide. Every return to confusion is another opportunity for depth. You learn to navigate not by avoiding darkness, but by trusting. The psyche, once fragmented, begins to flow again. The thread of awareness connects all things. The light, the shadow, the collapse, the rebirth, and then you understand. Meaning was never lost. It was buried beneath the ruins of your control. The labyrinth was not a test to escape, but a sacred geometry of return. Return to self, to silence, to the center that has always been waiting, because in the end, the true purpose of collapse is revelation, and the only way to find yourself is to lose everything that isn't you. When the labyrinth dissolves, what remains is not enlightenment, it is simplicity. You wake one morning and the world feels unchanged, yet something within you has shifted beyond recognition. The familiar hum of chaos that once defined your days is gone, replaced by a strange calm. You feel as though you are standing at the edge of your own ruins, barefoot, breathing, alive. This is the awakening of the self, not a burst of light, but the quiet realization that you were never separate from what you sought. Jung described this as the moment of integration, when consciousness and the unconscious, light and shadow, reconcile into one living totality. The war inside ends not with victory, but with surrender. At first, integration feels alien. You have spent years, maybe decades, fighting your reflection, judging your emotions, rejecting your impulses, fearing your darkness. Now suddenly, they sit beside you like old companions. You realize that anger is not evil, but energy. Fear is not weakness, protection. Grief, not punishment, but proof of love. The same forces that once tore you apart now move through you with grace. Jung called this the union of opposites, the conjunctio, the sacred marriage of psyche. It is not perfection, it is wholeness. You begin to live differently. The ego, once obsessed with control, loosens its grip. You no longer chase meaning as if it were external treasure. You recognize that every encounter, every conflict, every silence is an expression of the same total field of consciousness. The unconscious is no longer a threat, but an ally. It speaks through intuition, dreams, and synchronicity, those strange coincidences that feel orchestrated by an unseen intelligence. Jung saw these not as miracles, but as evidence that the self, once hidden, now participates actively in your reality. The boundaries between inner and outer dissolve. The psyche and the world begin to move in rhythm. Science, once skeptical of such phenomena, now finds echoes of this integration in the body itself. Research from the University of Wisconsin shows that long-term contemplative practice rewires the brain, strengthening connections between the limbic and prefrontal region. Emotional storms that once ruled behavior now pass without control. Trauma integration therapy demonstrates similar findings. The nervous system learns to remain present even under stress. What Jung described metaphorically as the union of opposites is reflected neurological coherence, harmony between emotion and thought. But awakening is not an escape from the human condition. It is a deeper descent into it. Jung warned that after illumination comes the opus mundi, the work of returning to the world. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, he wrote, but by making the darkness conscious. The point of integration is not to retreat into transcendence, but to incarnate awareness in daily life, to bring consciousness into every mundane gesture, washing, listening to another, walking through rain. The awakened soul does not float above suffering. It moves through it with compassion. There is an ancient parallel in myth. After his enlightenment, the Buddha did not vanish into nirvana. He sat beneath the tree until the world returned to him, then rose and walked back into the villages barefoot to teach. In Christian mysticism, after Christ descends into hell and resurrects, he does not ascend immediately. He stays among his disciples, breaking bread, touching wounds. Jung saw in these stories the pattern of integration, the return. Once the self is awakened, its purpose is not isolation, but service. Consciousness seeks to illuminate the collective darkness. The individual becomes bridge between worlds. You will know you are integrating when the world's noise no longer feels hostile. The judgments of others lose power. You stop trying to convince, to prove, to defend. Instead, you listen. You begin to sense the same archetypal forces that once tore you apart, moving through everyone else. The mother, the hero, the victim, the tyrant. You see humanity not as chaos, but as a vast orchestra of unfinished songs. Compassion becomes natural, not moral. You understand that to forgive another is to forgive yourself. Yet integration does not mean the end of conflict. The shadow still moves, but now you recognize its language. When jealousy rises, you smile. When fear tightens your chest, you breathe. Each emotion becomes an instrument, not an enemy. Jung compared this to alchemy's rubedo, the final reddening, the stage where the alchemist, once burned by fire, now walks within it unharmed. The fire has become light. There are moments, of course, when the old world pulls you back, when doubt returns, when despair whispers, when the weight of the unconscious feels unbearable again. But this time, you no longer mistake darkness for failure. You understand it as rhythm, the eternal breath of creation and destruction. You realize that the path never ends. It spirals. The self is not a destination, but a dynamic balance, a living dialogue between chaos and order, shadow and light. Consciousness must be renewed again and again, just as the sun must rise after every night. And so you begin to live mythologically, not as superstition, but as awareness. You see every day as symbolic, the sunrise as rebirth, the storm as purification, the stranger's smile as the self greeting itself through another. You understand that meaning is not hidden behind reality. It is reality. The world itself becomes an extension of psyche, a living text written by conscious. Jung called this unus mundus, the one world where matter and spirit are two reflections of the same truth. The return to the world after awakening is not triumphant, it is humble. You carry no revelations, no doctrines, no need to preach. You carry presence. The light in your eyes becomes enough. People who cross your path feel it, though they may not understand why. They sense, perhaps for the first time, that peace is not something to find, it is something to remember. Because in the end, awakening is not becoming divine, it is becoming fully human. The self does not float above the world, it kneels within it. It feels deeply, loves fiercely, and dies conscious. Integration means living with open eyes, seeing the shadow in all things and choosing again and again not to turn away. And if you can do that, if you can stand at the threshold of the world with both light and darkness in your hands and call them by their true names, you have completed the circle. The descent becomes ascent, the abyss becomes mirror, and life finally becomes sacred. There comes a moment, quiet and almost invisible, when the journey through the abyss turns into something else. It is not escape, not redemption, even peace. It is recognition. You begin to understand that the abyss was never outside you. It was the architecture of your becoming. Every wound, every loss, every descent was a necessary act in the unfolding of consciousness. Jung called this the eternal return, the cycle through which the psyche descends into darkness only to rise again, forever transformed, yet never finished. For consciousness is not a linear ascent toward light. It is a rhythm, an ancient breathing of the universe through the soul. In this final stage, you see that the shadow once feared is now inseparable from wisdom. The abyss you once begged to escape becomes a sacred teacher. You realize that suffering was never punishment. It was initiation into the mystery of being alive. You remember Jung's words, "The gods have become. Only by making them conscious can we heal." The monsters of the unconscious were not curses, but deities exiled by reason, waiting to be reintegrated. To make them conscious is to restore divinity to the human. You begin to perceive the world differently. Every sound, every face, every flicker of light is charged with significance. The mundane transforms into revelation. The boundary between inner and outer dissolves until the universe feels like a single organism, dreaming itself through you. The sun rises not in the sky, but in the heart. This is what Jung meant by the self. Totality experienced from within the human form. The divine does not live above, it lives through. But the eternal return is not rest, it is participation. Once you have seen the unity behind opposites, life demands that you live it consciously. To be awake is to bear witness, to hold the tension of love and terror without collapsing into either. Jung called this holding the opposite, the supreme task of consciousness. It means feeling joy while knowing it will vanish, loving the world even as you see its cruelty, embracing death as part of life's pulse. To live this way is not to transcend humanity, but to fulfill it. Science, in its own way, is beginning to glimpse this truth. Quantum physics suggests that observation itself shapes reality, that consciousness and matter are interwoven. Neuroscience finds that mystical states dissolve the brain's sense of separation, generating feelings of unity with all things. What the mystics called God and Jung called the self may be the same fundamental field of awareness manifesting through different forms. The eternal return, then, is not myth, but cosmology. The universe itself seems to oscillate between creation and destruction, expansion and collapse, as if mirroring the psyche's own evolution. There is a moment after awakening when you look back at your life and see the invisible hand of the unconscious in every event. Every heartbreak was a doorway, every failure a redirection, every loss a preparation. You realize that nothing, not even the madness, descent, the terror, the silence, all of it was choreography, the psyche teaching itself through experience, meaning no longer needs to be invented. It reveals itself as the pattern that was always there. In mythic terms, this is the return of the hero, not as conqueror, but as messenger. You come back from the underworld carrying no treasures, but understanding. The treasure is consciousness itself, the ability to see, to endure, to love without illusion. Jung wrote that every individual who becomes conscious adds to the light of the world. The task is endless because the world itself is a dream still awakening. Each soul that faces its abyss shifts the collective balance ever so slightly toward wholeness. The signs of this final integration are subtle. You stop searching for meaning in drama. The noise of ambition fades. Silence becomes familiar, even holy. You find beauty in imperfection, the crack in a wall, the wrinkle on a face, the tremor in a voice. The divine hides not in transcendence, but in decay. You understand now that consciousness does not seek escape from mortality. It seeks to illuminate it. Life is not a riddle to be solved, but an act to be lived fully with awareness. And yet, even now, the abyss waits, not as threat, but as rhythm. One day when life shatters again, and it will, you will descend once more. But this time, you will not be afraid. You will know that the fall is not a failure, but a return to the beginning. You will walk into the darkness willingly, with the light of awareness as your lantern. The self does not fear repetition, because it understands that every cycle deepens understanding. Consciousness expands not by escaping the abyss, but by learning to live within it. The alchemists said, "Solve et coagula," dissolve and unite. Every dissolution prepares a higher union. Every death gives birth to a greater life. You are both the fire and the metal, both the crucible and the gold. The eternal return means that nothing truly ends, it only transforms. The abyss becomes womb, the wound becomes wisdom, and the shadow becomes light refracted through matter. And so the journey concludes where it began, with the silence before creation. But now you hear it differently. The silence is alive, breathing, vast. It no longer frightens you because you recognize it as yourself. The abyss does not stare back anymore. It listens, it waits. You step forward into the world once more, neither saint nor sinner, neither master nor victim, simply conscious. You know that you will fall again and rise again and fall again, for that is the rhythm of existence. The eternal return is not a curse. It is grace repeating itself through time, refining the soul until it shines with the quiet brilliance of awareness. And in that final realization, you whisper, not as prayer but as truth, "I am not the one who, I am the abyss, learning to see."